Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janavala Bhagiri Varadhari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janavala Bhagiri Varadhari Yashoda Nandana Vraja Jana Ranjana Jamuna Tiravanachari Yashoda Nandana Vrajajana Ranjana Jamuna Tiravanachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janavala Bhagiri Varadhari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janavala Bhagiri Varadhari Yashoda Nandana Vrajajana Ranjana Jamuna Tiravanachari Yashoda Nandana Vrajajana Ranjana Jamuna Tiravanachari Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Oops. Thank you. I guess one advantage of having a big high seat like this is I get to use it like a chair. Om Ajnanatimidandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Mukhaṁ karoti vachalam pangum langhayate girim Yatkripatamahang bande Shri Gurun Dinataranam. Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatyadesh Tarine Panchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. It's always a treat for me to be with the devotees here in San Diego. I have a little history here. I mean, I was born in San Diego about 1 million years ago. And I've lived here a few times, and I started attending the temple in San Diego in 1970, late 1970. I had been living in the temple in Honolulu, took a little vacation for a couple of months. Actually, as soon as I got here, in the middle of the winter from Honolulu, I realized I needed to get back to Hawaii and be serious about my practice and try to be able to see if I could move back into the temple. We lived here. I lived here a little for a few months just after I was married, just after Sri Sri Radha Giridhari were installed. That was 50 years ago. And then we lived here. My family and I lived here in the late 80s and through the 90s. I have a little history here. I've known some of the devotees here for quite a while, and just always happy to be here. I hadn't forgotten about June gloom, but when I arrived on Thursday, I thought, well, maybe it was over. I remember one year the marine layer extended into August. This was maybe sometime in the early 90s. And during the summer, I had a job teaching English at a foreign language school downtown. And they had a special summer program for students who would come and visit San Diego for 3 weeks. And for the whole 3 weeks of that session, the students were complaining about the weather. I said, yeah, I know it's supposed to be done sometime in June, but the clouds have been very generous to us this year. Quick question, 2 quick questions actually. Is there anyone here who hasn't been to a Hare Krishna center before? Oh, well, welcome. Happy to see you. Anyone who hasn't been to this Hare Krishna center before? Oh, and welcome. We're happy to have you here. We have, as Amogalila observed, a kind of an intimate crowd tonight. So we'll see what happens. Third question. Anybody here kind of like peace? Let me see the hands. This is where I get more hands. Anybody like peace? Yeah, okay. Me too. But let's face it, the world's a mess. I mean, we've always said that, right? I'm almost 76 years old. I don't know how many ends of the world I have lived through. Between the Jehovah's Witnesses and other kind of interesting, I guess mostly Christian groups, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was pretty real. So this is, that peace is a problem. And there always seem to be a few wars going on. Now we've got one that's a little scary in Europe. And that'll, on top of all the things that appear to be happening due to some global climate change. I think the evidence grows by the day. The doubters are dwindling by the day. I've just asked people in New York. Well, no, even better, the people in Canada where the fires are. I just saw a headline today. I didn't read the article, but I saw the headline on my phone. They can't put the fires out in Canada. They keep trying, but they don't seem to be expecting much success. But there's always some sort of conflict between international wars and domestic turbulence. That's nothing new. We thought we invented it back in the 60s, but it really wasn't anything new. This kind of anxiety is something that seems to it really seems to be part of life in the material world. Very difficult to avoid. But it's something that's very desirable, and Krishna addresses it in at least a couple of places in the Bhagavad Gita. So I thought we'd take a look at a couple of those and some other places where this is discussed in our scriptures. So the first I was thinking of was a text toward the end of the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Nastir buddhir ayuktasya nacha yuktasya bhavana nacha bhavayata shantir ashantasya kuta sukham. Krishna says to his friend Arjuna, one who's not in transcendental consciousness can have neither a controlled mind nor steady intelligence, without which there's no possibility of peace. And, he asks, how can there be any possibility of happiness? How can there be any happiness without peace? So, a big part of this comes from our own consciousness. As we'll see, I'm going to take a look at a purport in early in Srimad Bhagavatam. A couple of probably my favorite sentences in the English language, as I'll explain when we get there. So this is a big thing. And then Krishna says later in the Bhagavad Gita, he gives us what Srila Prabhupada calls a formula for peace. So international peace actually begins with inner peace, with personal peace. And that's something that we seem to have a difficult time finding. Nowadays we have apps, right? So many apps. And you go to download an app and then you find out in-app purchases, right? Which means you get the bare bones, but the good meditations or meditative music or whatever it is are going to cost you a couple bucks a month. Well, sometimes it's just a couple of bucks, but sometimes it's a couple bucks a month. And then you have to think about it. And then we buy the app and we forget it's there. It's just like there's a whole other page of icons, on our screen. The people who, even some of the great meditation teachers will tell you what terrible meditators they are. I've heard, anybody heard of Pema Chodron? She's a very well-known Buddhist nun, even older than I am, if it's imaginable. And I've heard some of her talks where she confesses that, I'm just not good at meditating. But she keeps trying, and she keeps at it. So at the end of the 5th chapter, Krishna gives us a formula for peace. Bhoktaram jagyatapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram suhridam sarvabhutanam gyatva mam shantam rachati. 3 things Krishna says, will help us attain real peace. Bhoktaram, 3 kinds of awareness of 3 things. Bhoktaram jagyatapasam sarvaloka maheshwaram. So he says, I'm the supreme enjoyer. I am actually the real beneficiary even of austerities and penances and sacrifices and all kinds of religious activities that people engage in. Those are all meant for me. Sarvaloka maheshwaram. I own the whole joint, the whole cosmos. It's actually mine. It comes from me. So we might be thinking, oh gosh. So everything comes from you, everything belongs to you, everything's meant for you. What's there for me? And he has an answer for that too. He says, Suhridam sarvabhutanam. He says, I am the dearmost friend of every living entity. So if we have a friend who has easy access to everything, he can share it. That's what friends do, right? They share. We share with each other. Krishna and his friends share lunch, right? And those boys, they have a very peaceful life sometimes. They also have adventures pretty much every day. They come back, tell the grown-ups about it, and the grown-ups' eyes roll, and oh my God. And not another one of these tall boys and their tales, right? Boys and their stories. However, as I was mentioning the other night in Chula Vista, in the morning, when all the boys go out to herd the cows with Krishna and his big brother Balaram, Mother Yashoda will take Balaram aside and say, okay, you keep your little brother out of trouble today. I don't want to hear any of these stories today. Just, you boys be good today. Let's not have any big adventures. Never works out like that. There's always another adventure. I mean, we read about a few of them in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So if we have such a friend, then whatever we need, whatever we might want, all we have to do is ask. He can share. When the boys, when Krishna and his friends are sharing lunches, Krishna's mother and father, they're like the king and queen of their cowherd community. So they're the wealthiest. So Krishna, our spiritual master, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, whose image you see here, he explains, on a number of occasions, he's explained that because Krishna's family is the wealthiest, he always has the nicest lunch when they take their lunches out in the forest and they sit down and have a picnic together. And so he's got all kinds of fancy things like ladus, kachoris, puris, halava, sweet rice, stuff like that. The other boys, Prabhupada said on a couple of occasions, the other boys have dal rice and chapatis, more simple lunch. Very healthy and very tasty, but not quite as fancy. And quite often, Krishna will share his lunch with them. Sometimes, the boys end up with Krishna's fancy lunch and he ends up with their dal, chapatis, and rice. Sometimes they play keep away with each other's lunch. Right? Somebody will grab one of the boys' lunch bags and throw it to another boy, and they'll play keep away until the other little boy will break down and cry, and then they'll give it back to him. So, and sometimes the boys, they'll take a bite out of something and it's really good. They'll say, "Hey, Krishna, you got to check this out," and they'll give him their laddu with a big bite already taken out of it, and he'll take a bite and go, "Oh yeah." And he'll probably be thinking, he's probably thinking, it's even better because my buddy tasted this. So if we have a friend like that, then that's, that means something might be available to us for our happiness. And then, let's see if I can do this. I always find myself apologizing for trying to navigate an electronic text. I have a lot of experience navigating analog texts. However many years I said I was old, minus 3 or 4. But, nope. There's shucks. Oh Lord, you're supposed to do what I say. Anyway, in the second verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam, the verse actually explains what the Bhagavatam's about, gives a sense of it. It's called the Vastu Nirdesha shloka, and it explains what it's about, essentially. But this verse also explains who the audience that is most likely to appreciate this text is. And it's quite an extensive text, 18,000 verses. And it says it's for those who are pure at heart. And they're pure in heart because they don't have any envy of anyone else. They're not trying to they're not competing for the things that other people are competing for. And it says right out of the gate in that verse that's because they don't have any self-interest. They've already given up the pursuit of personal virtue, material progress, pleasure, and even liberation, release from all kinds of suffering. That's not their interest. Their only interest is learning how to love the absolute truth, Sri Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And in his commentary on this verse, in his purport, Srila Prabhupada makes a point that everyone in the world is competing for something that someone else wants. I think he's human to human, animal to animal, nation to nation, all these, there's all kinds of conflict going on. But, he says, the transcendental devotees of the Lord not only don't compete with others for the resources of material nature, or anything, even like fame and money or anything. Instead, they strive to create a competition-less society with God at the center. Would you like me to share a secret? It's not so secret. I've shared it about 1,000 and maybe 1,500 times. I read that sentence probably in December of 1969 or January of 1970. And when I read that sentence, I realized that I had found the revolution we were all looking for back then. In the 60s, there was a lot of social upheaval, a lot of attempts at serious social change. We all wanted to, we all wanted peace. All we are saying is give peace a chance. We had peace signs drawn all over the place. I remember when I was in the Navy, when I was going to intelligence analyst school, and someone had written a graffito in the stall of one of the bathrooms at the building where some of our classes were held, and it said, "Fight for peace." And I just thought, what? I'm doing this, I enlisted in the Navy to keep from getting drafted into the infantry, for goodness sake. Fight for peace. I just want to finish my 4 years and get the heck out. But, so this is a big thing. When I read that sentence, that convinced me that I was going to make this my life. I was already interested in it from my readings in the Bhagavad Gita. But right in the second verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, I found the key to it's just like, it all just kind of, and I just said, the other stuff's done. The other stuff's done. It just doesn't mean much to me anymore. And then, in his this is particularly galling because I'm a person who's easily embarrassed. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. In his preface to the Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada addresses this whole thing. And it's just 2 paragraphs. I've always loved these. This is also some of my favorite writing. This was really important for me to have read back then. Srila Prabhupada writes, and he's writing this in the 50s. So this is a kind of forward-looking, very broad perspective on the world. He writes, "We must know the present need of human society. And what is that need? Human society is no longer bounded by geographical limits to particular countries or communities. Human society is broader than in the Middle Ages, and the world tendency is toward one state or one human society. The ideals of spiritual communism, according to Srimad Bhagavatam, are based more or less on the oneness of the entire human society, nay, of the entire energy of living beings. The need is felt by great thinkers to make this a successful ideology. Srimad Bhagavatam will fill this need in human society. It begins, therefore, with an aphorism of Vedanta philosophy, Janmad Yasya Yataha, to establish the ideal of a common cause. The common cause is the pursuit of love for the absolute truth, the pursuit of love for Krishna. He continues, human society at present moment is not in the darkness of oblivion. It has made rapid progress in the fields of material comforts, education, and economic development throughout the entire world. But there is a pinprick somewhere in the social body at large. And therefore there are large-scale quarrels even over less important issues. There's a need of a clue as to how humanity can become one in peace, friendship, and prosperity with a common cause. Srimad Bhagavatam will fill this need, for it is a cultural presentation for the re-spiritualization of the entire human society. So, my spiritual master, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, went to great pains to make this kind of knowledge available to everyone in the world. As many of you know, he was turning 70 when he got on a freighter. Before that, he had given up his family life and gone to live in the transcendental village of Vrindavan, now the transcendental city of Vrindavan, I guess, and began writing a translation, composing a translation of this Srimad Bhagavatam for the benefit of human society. And it wasn't easy for him. He was living as a sadhu, and in Vrindavan they live by begging. And that's how he lived. He didn't have an income. He didn't have like a social security check coming every month. And he didn't have a bunch of people supporting him in the background. He didn't have a foundation behind him or anything like that. He was a simple sadhu who went out and begged for the money for the food that he cooked for himself and ate, to pay for the very humble rooms that he stayed in a very old and sacred temple, and for the paper needed to print the volumes of Srimad Bhagavatam when he had finished writing and editing. And then, when he had completed the first book, the first canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, translating it to English, and along with his own commentary, he begged a ride to India, and he came as he was turning 70, or 69, I guess, by our figuring, right?
No, he turned 70. He turned 69. You're right. He was 69.
Yeah. He said 70. He said 70 because I think they figure from conception or something like that. So,
Your birthday is when you're born.
right, but you become 1 year old, but you become one a year later. So it's a little complicated. So as he was approaching his 70th birthday, there we go. I think that's how I'm going to try to say it from now on. And on a freighter. It wasn't on one of those Norwegian cruise line ships or something like that. He had a guest cabin on a freighter, and he had 2 heart attacks. There were some rough seas along the way, and he thought that one point that would kill him. The seasickness would do him in, and then he had 2 heart attacks crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and survived them, and then had another stroke a couple of years later, or heart attack. I'm not quite sure that we know clearly which it was. So this was, and he arrived in New York City with no money, no contacts, no nothing, and then started out living. He lived in an office. He lived in an office in some part of New York City, and then he lived in the Bowery for a while. And then some of the young people who found themselves intrigued by him found him a place on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and pushed on. He just kept pushing. He didn't give up. because he felt society, and especially after he got to New York City and saw, oh, this is even more interesting than Kolkata or Delhi, and even more interesting place. He observed, everybody seems to have a car here. Of course, nowadays we figure nobody really drives in New York City because who can afford to park? I mean, if you can afford a parking place in New York City, you can probably, like a parking spot in a garage or parking lot or whatever they have there. You can probably afford to just helicopter to work or something. It's just so crazy there. But he pushed through all these things to try to get the world's attention, so they would have the opportunity to understand the message of these transcendental texts, because he's convinced, as we see in this preface, that this is the real solution. This is the radical solution in the actual sense. Radical comes from the Latin word radix, which means root. So this goes to the root cause of all our difficulties. This business of, we create a zero-sum game out of living in this world, right? If I get ahead, somebody else has to fall behind. It doesn't really have to be like that. What Srila Prabhupada is suggesting is a cooperative society with God at the center. We all have this common cause of actually finding peace so that we can attain real life of genuine value, a real life based on substantive values, and those are also mentioned in the Bhagavatam. A simple life, clean life, peaceful life, sane life, where we all see ourselves, as Srila Prabhupada says here, not just human beings, but all creatures as our brothers and sisters. And this perspective has its pinnacle, we feel, in the teachings of Srimad Bhagavatam, but it's not unique to Vaishnavism, Hare Krishnaism, or anything like that. This is like one perspective on what's sometimes referred to as the perennial philosophy. This is the actual perspective of all mystic traditions in all religions. The spiritual part of all religions. And we see that among Christians, we see that among Jews, Kabbalists and folks like that. Among the Muslims, there are the Sufis, and there are certain strains of Buddhism that are very mystical. They have this idea that, they come to the realization. They get the idea because someone else has come to the realization, and they seek this realization themselves, that my actual identity is not what I figure it to be. I mean, this is some of the great Buddhist teachers say, this is what the Buddha meant when he taught anatta or anatma, no self. It didn't mean that you don't exist necessarily, but some will tell you, some of these are some of the greatest contemporary scholars in Buddhism, that they'll tell you that what this means is the self you conceive is not you. That's not you. And so that's consistent with the experience of mystics in every religious tradition, that I'm consciousness, and that my nature is not just existence, but awareness and bliss. Those are my potentials. Now, we pretty much can accept that we exist, and some of us may or may not be aware that we are inherently aware. We're aware of the world. We're aware of, and we're also aware of our own selves. And we're all striving for some kind of happiness. Some kind of happiness. If not bliss, at least pleasure, which we take for happiness. Although philosophically that's not. Happiness actually means well-being. And some of those folks who have the most money and the most influence, the most power, they're not blissful, they're not happy people. I've already given away my age, so I can say one big example from our recent history was this fellow Howard Hughes, who in his heyday was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And he owned movie studios, which means, practically speaking, he owned movie starlets. I mean, the dude had it all. He invented. He was an inventor. He was a film magnate, a pilot, all kinds of, and very, 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 very wealthy. But in his old age, he had completely lost his mind out of anxiety, worrying about all that wealth. And he was a hermit. He was a recluse. Didn't trust anybody. He was scared of. He was afraid of people. He was afraid of germs. He was afraid of anything that might take away what he had become so attached to. And if we look at some of the wealthy people that we see nowadays, we know they're not blissful either. Just think of some of them. Even those who seem fulfilled, they're always trying to do something else, something more. Like this fellow Elon Musk, he wants to build himself spaceships, so he can go, ride in spaceships. So this is somebody who's really not satisfied. He's got more money than 1 million people would need to live comfortably, long lives. But he's not satisfied with that. And of course, and many people lionize him just because of his wealth and because of his creativity. He's actually a creative person. Anyway, we see any of these so-called billionaires. They're generally not happy people unless they've found something more than just the money. Found some way to use the money for good rather than just for their own aggrandizement. That's a little rare, and when we see that happening, people celebrate it like crazy. So these things don't give us real peace. Money can't buy you love, right? Especially people my age, we knew that. We sang that God knows how many times every day for years. Of course, they also had a counter song to that. Oh, that was the song. I don't care so much for money. But then they had the other song. Just give me money. That's what I want. So both things were there. But essentially, I don't care so much for money because money can't buy me love. That's just not going to happen. Love is an exchange between hearts, and that's the kind of thing that we're all looking for, and we're all looking for the perfect friend. And that friend is here. We find him here in the Srimad Bhagavatam and in the Bhagavad Gita. Dearmost friend to everyone, he says. Suhridang sarvabhutanam. Srila Prabhupada explains, clock's ticking. Srila Prabhupada explains sometimes that there are 3 broad categories of friends. One is bandhu, kind of a casual acquaintance. Another is mitra, like a buddy. And then there's suhrit. That means his or her heart is always focused on you and your well-being. Just as our guru used to sign on the letters to us, your ever well-wisher. What he was saying was, because I'm Krishna's devotee, I'm Krishna's friend, I'm also suhrit. I'm always thinking of you. Now, I think of examples like that. There was one letter he wrote to one disciple, one of his older disciples, even before me, joined before I did. He says, sometimes you cook for me, sometimes I cook for you. That is love. So the guru sometimes, he would serve his students. So we're looking for that kind of love we can count on, love that won't flag, love that won't be fickle. So that's a suhrit friend. That's the best friend, the dearmost friend of every living entity. And that's where we find happiness. We actually find happiness when we find real love. And we have that experience even with the love the love we enjoy in this world, but among ourselves. Well, with our friends, with our partners or spouses, our children or parents. That's where we find real happiness. And I was just sharing with one of the devotees this afternoon the end of a novel with a certain perspective on the Mahabharata. And it's a novel that presents the Mahabharata from the perspective of Draupadi, who was the wife of the Pandavas. And in that last chapter, this is somebody who's been looking for love her whole life and hasn't found real love, and then realizes in this novel, right at the very end, that she's always had that love. From the very beginning of her life, Krishna was always there, encouraging her, sometimes egging her on, supporting her, loving her. And she realized at the end that she actually, the love that she had been seeking, it had always been there. And it's a part of the book that I find a little difficult to read without becoming emotional, quite consistently, actually. And somehow or other, I find the writing so lovely and the sentiments that are expressed so lovely that I've shared it maybe with 12.5 people. Every time with this, well, except once. But once I was able to read it and get through it without getting too emotional. But this is what we're looking for. We're looking for that kind of love that affords us real happiness, and that's a peaceful life. And if everybody has that, if every one of us has what we need, what we need, then we don't need to struggle with each other. It's real easy to wish everyone well when you're well situated, when you have what you need. And that's what we're looking for. And we've been given a very easy process in this age for actually attaining the peace afforded by that kind of love. And I was discussing with devotees down in Chula Vista the other night that this is really the whole thing, what we were just doing just before, this chanting and dancing and enjoying spiritualized food that actually has the same power as the Absolute Truth himself, that becomes transmogrified, I guess, in one way, or what do they call it in the church? Transubstantiated, I guess, in a sense. It actually becomes Krishna. Actually, it was Krishna, because Krishna is everything in a sense. At this process, it's something that's custom made for folks like us. Folks who have busy lives. Now, it's also possible to go live like a hermit in the forest or in a cave and meditate on the holy name, even on the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. But how many of you were here last night? Oh, not enough of you. Listen, as Kurt Vonnegut, to paraphrase Kurt Vonnegut, if that wasn't fun, I don't know what is. I think I characterized it with some of my friends as a completely transcendental silliness. We bathed our deities on the altar with flower petals, rose petals, and gardenia petals. I also saw at least one box of gardenias. Petals from 9,000 roses. That's a lot. And at the end, as Joseph observed when he showed up in the middle of it last night, literally, there's no hyperbole at all here. There are pictures, you can find pictures already on Facebook that'll attest to this. Ankle deep in flower petals, this whole floor. Ankle deep, and everyone was throwing flower petals on everyone else after they got, after they were thrown on the deities, then they were thrown out to us, and everybody was. I had one friend who kept pouring what must have felt. I mean, I was thinking, it must be like she must be using 5-gallon bucket, because it would be like 10, 15, 20, 25 seconds, and flowers are still pouring on my head. It was, and everybody was just having the blast. I don't think there was anyone, even me, who didn't have a smile that was ready to break their face or something. It was just so much. It was just fun, and chanting, kirtans that themselves were absolutely immersive, and then we were having so much fun. And yeah, and we took that fun out to the beach. That was even more fun. Just ask anybody in any of the bars or clubs or whatever they are that were along our route. And people in the apartments along the beach. They were on their balconies, waving their arms and swaying and smiling at us. And people in the bars, they stood up and were, there was a bar with the outside part. There was another bar that was all indoors, and the people indoors, they were standing up and waving their arms and jumping up and down, and some of them even chanting. So this Srila Prabhupada sometimes says this process is simple and sublime. I mean, come on, it can just be fun. When I was a kid in the 60s, we used to have hootenannies. There was this big folk music revival back in the late 50s and into the 60s. And we used to have hootenannies. And the big feature of hootenanny is it's all about singing along. One of my favorite musicians back then was a gentleman named Pete Seeger, who's unfortunately passed away. Pete Seeger with his famous banjo with the legend around the rim, "This machine surrounds hatred and forces it to surrender." But his whole thing was, you all know these songs, the happy songs, the protest songs, whatever they are. You all know these songs. You sing them along with me. When I went to a few Pete Seeger concerts in Washington, D.C. when I was a teenager, and they had chairs up on the stage because they knew the house would be packed. As long as the fire marshal was cool with a couple hundred extra people, in the auditorium at George Washington University, it was fine. And sometimes up on that stage were other famous singers. Whenever he came to Washington, it was always Elizabeth Cotton, and one time Mississippi John Hurt. So the audience is right there. Part of the audience is right there with him. So this is what we do. These are like transcendental hootenannies. It's easy to learn the words. It won't take long to figure the words out. And we just roll with it, and we let that sound take us. And it's so purifying to our hearts, so soothing, like a transcendental balm. And so why not? Why shouldn't we try to share this with people? So I see the clock is ticking ever more loudly. So I'll stop here and see if there are any quick comments or any discussion, questions or anything. Objections? Anybody here want to object to a peaceful life? Yes?
One of your comments was that...
Hold on.
We have mics, yeah.
Thank you. One of your comments was love is an exchange between hearts, which was beautiful. My question is then, what is unrequited love?
Pain. Isn't it? We have a technical term that we use called rasa. And rasa really it has a number of meanings, like all interesting words. Sometimes it's juice, sometimes it's taste. But when we talk about rasa in the spiritual sense, what we're talking about is the taste that's enjoyed when there is that exchange of love between ourselves and the Absolute. And it's composed of 5 different elements. that make it all work. And they all work to kind of like work together to kind of constantly increase it. But if we feel some, I don't know if we, it feels like love to us, ardor, I guess, attachment for someone who won't or can't return it. It's just pain. And we don't know how many songs have been written about that pain. Or poems, right? That's part of our experience. Now, sometimes when you meet that person, that we think we love, and there becomes a real exchange of heart, sometimes we find out there's a little darkness there that's maybe, or there's something that's not so good, and the attachment itself might even cause more pain. But wow, I didn't see that question coming. It's a good one. Stumped the Swami. But obviously, it's pain, and it's certainly not the kind of love that we all need, that we all seek, that we all need. We want that exchange of love, and it's dynamic. It's constantly growing. There's no limit to it. Boundless. Boundless in a couple of ways, right? It breaks down the boundaries between you and I. When there's love, you and I become something else. We become us, or we, right? That's the whole romantic thing. You and me against the world. Romeo and Juliet. God. Their families had hated each other for so long that no one could even remember why. It didn't make any sense. And here they were, so much in love that they gave their lives to it, tragically. Star-crossed lovers. That's that whole thing. But this is, this is the love that we're looking for. We're looking for this, something that's actually fulfilling, something that actually grows our hearts. What we think of as unrequited love, it's just constantly like stabbing at our hearts. It's just like pain. You think of the other person, it hurts. You see the other person, it hurts. You see the other person with someone else, forget about it, right? So that's not the love we're looking for. We're looking for the right match. And Krishna is the right match for everybody. He's described at the very beginning of one text analyzing how this love grows and what it looks like, called Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. The very first word in that text is Akhila Rasamrita Murti. That means that he is the embodiment of all kinds of love. He can reciprocate everyone's love, every variety of love. And so that's the kind of love that will give us that happiness that we're all looking for, I think. Is that a good start? Salvaged myself a little bit. Yes, ma'am, is that a question?
Well, I have a question that...
Here comes the microphone.
There's something that my nanny only speaks and understands Hindi, so how can she understand?
I'm sorry, I missed something.
My nanny only speaks Hindi, so how can she understand?
My grandmother only speaks Hindi, so how she can understand in English?
Oh, well, your grandmother only speaks Hindi. She may not understand when I say it unless I'm really speaking from the heart. There's a Sufi saint who has written that whatever is spoken from the heart will enter another person's heart. And whatever is spoken from just from the tongue doesn't go any deeper than the ear. So if I'm actually speaking from my heart, there's something she'll feel at least. However, if I had studied Hindi, I would be able to do that even more easily. Even though my heart isn't there yet. I would. So she can understand this knowledge. She may not be able to understand my speaking, but if someone with a better heart than mine who also speaks Hindi were to share this with her, it would pierce her heart and change it, melt it like honey. So does that mean I have to now I have to start studying Hindi on Duolingo, Babbel, Rosetta Stone, and Hindi Pod 101, all the different steps, websites. Maybe I should do that. Maybe after all, I'm young. I have a lot of time. And it's real easy to learn stuff when you're young. So, I mean, you speak Hindi too?
A little bit.
You can share it with her.
Maybe you can explain
How's that?
in Hindi.
Would that work?
I don't know how much, or maybe.
To the extent that you understand, to the extent that you actually feel it yourself, that you'll be able to share with her. And she'll not only understand your words, but she'll feel your heart because, well, she already does. I'm a grandfather. I know what it's like. So you can help her like that. So you can study Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam and Hindi. And keep chanting Hare Krishna all the time, whenever you can. And then you'll be able to help her understand as well. Is that okay? Do you think you can take that challenge up? Maybe not right away, but you can think about it. You can work toward it. I think that would make you happy.
Okay.
Okay? Do we have a deal? I'll add Hindi to my languages, to the languages I'm not actually studying very assiduously. Anything else? Oh, yes. Oh, we're out of time. I'm sorry. I apologize. Maybe we can speak later? Okay. All right. Thank you so much for your attention and your patience.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much.